Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. We have a self-selecting group of very hardcore Syria watchers so congratulations to getting here on a very snowy day. I'm Peter Berg and I run the International Security Program here at New America. We're here to discuss a new book by the Omran Center for Strategic Studies, Centralization.
Trisha, my lovely life.
Centralization and Decentralization in Syria, the concept and practice. We have two of the leaders of the Omran Center here who are also partners in residence at New America, and we frequently partner with them, including on this event today. First of all, Ammar Kahf, who is the founder and executive director of the Omran Center. Next to him is Yaser Tabbara, who is also a co-founder of the Omran Center, and we also have Mona Yacoubian, who is at the U.S. Institute of Peace and had a senior job at USAID during the Obama administration and is an expert on the region. So the Omran team will talk about the findings of the report, and then Mona is going to basically give some of her reactions to it, and then we'll open it up to a discussion with you.
I'm going to speak here. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming on this snowy day. Briefly, today we talk about our recent book at Omran, which started at the end of last year, actually. So some of the analysis or some of the data might be from the first quarter of 2018. However, what we talk is the macro, the big picture of how Syria looks like. And I wanted to start with this nice map that we produce at Omran, looking at the reality of today is a very fragmented Syria, is a Syria that has multiple armies of different countries involved, has multiple local actors. Even though this may be three colors or four, I think within each of those regions, whether it's the northeast, the north, and the northwest, or the south, there are also sub-regions that are uniquely different, that have totally different set of actors and influencing partners. And so from this fragmented scene, we looked at Omran, the incentive for the 10 scholars that participated in the 10 chapters of this book was to look at ways of how do we create a new legitimacy? How do we create a new page? How do you create something that brings back these pieces of the puzzle of Syria? And looking from a bottom-up approach, at the same time looking at the top-down approach, meaning we still need, and as Omran has always published before, the preservation of state institutions, we do need a strong central government, but yet how strong? Are we able to go back to the status quo ante, right, of 2011? Or is that even possible? Is it technically possible, not just wishful thinking, but also technically and in terms of the state infrastructure, is it able to do that? And also, what creates sustainability? What are the basic elements of a sustainable peace process in Syria? So we looked at the concept of decentralization and centralization, basically definitions, but also looking at experiments that took place in other countries, post-conflict countries, and also stable countries, much more stable countries, how they are able to create a, whether it's confessional, consociational, some sort of a consensus building type of a relationship between the government and the people, between the center and the peripheries. In Syria today, we have 14 provinces or governorates. Are these going to be the same? I mean, all the countries involved in Syria agree that territorial integrity, the unity of Syria, and I don't think any Syrian or non-Syrian disagrees on that. But how does that implemented? That's where everyone has a different analysis. As a Syria-focused think tank, we try to present the realities on the ground, and then how do we take these realities to create a new page in Syria that is united, but also that recognizes the differences in every region and every part, and the needs of the local populations. So we look at different, these are just the headlines of the chapters. The first one is basically conceptualizing the issues of definitions and how is it applied in multiple areas of conflict. Then we go into the different aspects, the functions of the state institutions in Syria or in any country per se, and looking at these functions, how do they apply? How are they applied in all these different zones in Syria? So looking at the political functions of the state, the security functions of the state. We've published a book last year on the security sector in Syria and how does it function and how will it function in the future. Then looking into the financial decentralization, how does it look like? We looked at the, am I going in the right order? Sorry. The judicial and legal infrastructure, so is it going to be one judiciary? Is it going to be multiple levels of judiciary that will allow, is it going to be one law? I mean, today we have multiple laws and that's very problematic. That creates this fragmentation. So how do we make sure that, these are the questions raised in the book and with some proposals actually. How do we make sure that at least the legal framework is the same between all these different zones? So, you know, you have the regime has a spoken set of laws and a practice set of laws. The opposition has adopted more or less the same regime laws, but modified them in different ways, in different cities and villages, in again, different ways of implementation. The Northeast has adopted a completely borrowed and new set of legal frameworks and a new, you know, even governance system. So it's a one-sided, self-declared federalism versus sometimes they call it the federation, and then they adopted the, or before that it was the democratic self-administration, autonomous administration, and then they said the federation, and then they went back, and then they formed ministries, and they formed judicial councils. So if I can start, since I started with the Northeast, but that would be one of the regions in on the map in Syria. These are the last 10 chapters, but just to give you an idea of how the book looks like. So in the democratic, what's called, or what they call themselves as the democratic autonomous administration, there is a top-down approach of governance. They declare that they will form local councils, but that has not yet been founded, and they have like ad hoc type appointed by the political party, the TEFDEM, which is the Movement for Democratic Society, that is predominantly controlled by the PYD. And so this top-down approach really forces the local actors to adopt something by the use of force and by the use of military wings. And we also have published a study on the military structures of the PYD and the democratic administration in the Northeast, really very fragmented within it, meaning they've adopted an anarchist, anti-state type approach, but yet they try to form state institutions that are parallel with one another, that overlap with one another, that contradict one another, and thus creating a lot of issues on the local population from all the sides of the local actors. So the lack of transparency in the financial administration, they've only announced budgets once in the Congress, or what they call the Majlis, the council that represents the Northeast. You have multiple layers of decision making that really, sometimes the decision maker is actually not present in the Northeast. So, you know, you reach a certain level and then there's some hidden decision maker that's beyond the borders. So it's a cross-national also institution. The multiple layers also, we noticed that they've, you know, first had the democratic self-administration, Idara Dhatiya, and then they said the Northern Federation, and they kept both structures working at the same time. They've announced ministries, multiple number of ministries as the executive branch, but a lot of them don't function, so they re-merged them together, they kept changing the names. So there's no stability even in terms of how they label them, and let alone the legal framework that doesn't adopt the same framework as adopted. So the regime has a Law 107 that was passed in 2011 that governs the local administration. They haven't adopted that, and they adopted another law in 2016 for local administration, and that was also not implemented. The other issue perhaps that I can say here is also the role of security forces, infiltrating and using the use of force to implement certain policies against the will of the local population. So the recent clashes, maybe not too recent by now, but a few months ago, where clashes took place between the Christian population and the Ph.D. administration in the Northeast because of the educational curriculum that was enforced upon them, and they did not want, it was forced again they sent the military forces to the schools to force teachers to teach a certain curriculum. So that caused a lot of friction within local populations. And then you have the issues of Raqqa, for example, a lot of the tribal figures there also having been clashed, and recently the assassination of one of its leaders, and the local council really not able to operate beyond just street cleaning and fixing potholes and maybe a few buildings, but still the demining hasn't taken place, the really consensus building of the local actors of the community, the return of local residents has not taken place. You go to places like Deir ez-Zor, you have also a clash between the military council that is predominantly Arab from the local population, and then a group resignation, and then the Ph.D. having back to come in to continue the fight against ISIS in that region. And then you have the Northeast also. So these are like at least 3 zones within the Northeast that I could outline. If I move to the regime side, the regime implemented or executed or held or conducted elections for local councils in September, actually, after we finished the book. But the same theory still applies because we noticed out of about 18,000 vacancies in local councils across the country, they had at least 40,000 nominations for these positions. Over 95%, if I may quote correctly, between 90 to 95 of those nominees came from the Ba'ath Party. So they did not even go through the traditional local so-called political parties that were allied with the regime. So before, we had something that's called the Jabhat al-Wataniya, which is the National Front, which is basically a shell cover to say that, hey, we bring other parties under the wing of the Ba'ath Party. So not even that act, that play that you used to play against the Syrian people, saying, oh, we allow political parties to participate. They didn't even do that. They just went straight to the Ba'ath Party. And so this is one feature of local governance, basically the Ba'ath Party taking over. Even though the Constitution took that article that says the Ba'ath Party is the ruling party for the government and state and society. That was taken out, but we witnessed an increased sense of infiltration of the Ba'ath Party. The number 2 feature in the north, in the south, and in regime areas is the infiltration of the security forces, much more than before. So being involved in every single bit and piece of the governance of the local population. The third, I would say, is the local administration law of 107 passed in 2011, first of all, gives far more authorities to the appointed governor of the province. So the governor has the right to use public properties, to all the financial, the administrative decision-making, and the elected bodies really have no say. And actually, we also monitored the budgets being awarded to local governance in regime areas, very, very little. Most of them did not get salaries for the last 8 years. Only the ones that report to the governor are the ones that are getting the funding and the authorities, and the governor is also head of the local security committee, so he also controls the security forces in those regions, intelligence basically, not the military. And so in the regime areas, I think those are probably the most, the features of that. There is a law that was passed, but it was never implemented, so it's much more centralized. However, there are localities of local militias that have been awarded geographical spots in Syria, in the regime areas, to basically giving them full rights of taxation and smuggling and controlling that region, even in terms of governance. We also noticed in the recent election in September, a lot of pro-Iranian figures that used to fight in militias, whether they were given citizenship or not, but more or less they were in a lot of those militias like Al-Baqir in the north, went and ran for elections, are now serving on the local council. So we witnessed Iran seeping through the cracks in that sense. I think I'm almost done with my time, right? But I'll finish with the opposition areas. Within the opposition areas went through several phases within the last 8 years, obviously. So the experience now, our numbers are about 458 local councils in the north. There is almost, you can say, 3 zones within the opposition areas. You have the Euphrates Shield, you have the Olive Branch or Afrin region, and then you have the Idlib and the surrounding of Idlib. So when you say Idlib, which is the demilitarized zone today, it includes parts of western Aleppo, it includes also northern Hama. So those also have some local councils. And I think, yeah, this has some of the numbers, if it's clear or not, I'm not sure. But the numbers, as we did a field study in May, and these are the general numbers. Now, there are discrepancies between the 3 zones, as I said, in terms of who is allowed to form a local council. So the government initially in 2011 has about 1,333 or 37 administrative units. So those are like cities, towns, you know, the different sizes, the 3 sizes of a village, a town, and a city, basically, with different rules of how it's governed. Now, the regime in September 2018 changed that and created new entities. And that's one of the ways that the regime is preempting the international community of whenever this constitution process begins even or ends, that the regime is always ahead, meaning, okay, international community, come in, do elections, we're already going to get the majority because they've broken up the gerrymandering, the whole like redistricting of cities, redefining how many councils per city. You have small cities in the suburbs of Damascus that used to be represented by 10, and now they have 10 times the population, and they changed the ratio of representation to allow those cities to be local loyalists to be rewarded, basically, by giving them extra seats now and in the future. So the opposition areas have more and more relied on elections. In our study in 2015, it was about 30% on elections. In our study in 2017 of local councils, at least 2/3 of them were either elections or consensus. So also about 1/3 that was based on general election. The other, when we say consensus, it's usually basically someone running for election and not being faced with an opponent. So then they would, the election committee would actually go out and announce the list and say, anyone from the residents has an objection on these people, submit your objection within like a week or a few days. And that's how at the end the election results are certified and says, well, so-and-so are the executive committee. A lot of local councils were faced by challenges, obviously, with security elements. So you have Jabhat al-Nusra or HTS in Idlib, also posing a great threat on the local councils. However, also our study this year in May, says that only out of the 268 local councils in Idlib, only 15% are self-proclaimed HTS followers, meaning they willfully, in their full free will, say that we are part of that terrorist organization. The rest operate within the region where HTS exists and terrorizes people, but they continue to do the fight. And I think that's one of the lessons that we see, that whenever local communities have a sense of ownership, they're able to push these extremist elements out even though it's very difficult and very challenging. And I think that's been one of the main challenges in the opposition areas. So other challenges in the opposition local councils has also been legal frameworks, meaning what is the reference point? About 30% adopt the Law 107. Others have modified it in different ways, adopted some parts of it, but not necessarily the entire. But the overall structure, there's a province, and there are cities under the province, at least as a structure. The relationship between the provincial council and the city council has been fluctuating throughout the years, meaning it's not very strong, mainly because of funding, but also that the process has not yet matured, in my opinion. I think I might have more during the discussion with questions and answers, but in opposition areas, most local councils that we have talked or trained or worked with, they view it as a bottom-up approach more than a central government trying to force something on them. So this is the approach in the mindset of many of the actors within the local councils. In the Northeast, it's more of the top-down approach. In the regime, it's a no approach. It's basically a security services encroaching on everybody's lives. So how do we restitch back, and this is Yaser's copyrighted since he's the lawyer amongst us.
It's okay, Omran owns it. So.
Omran owns it, okay. So how do we stitch back? And in fact, this is the, this is, well, you see the map with the stitches on it. So I'll leave that for Yaser to explain.
Thank you, Ammar. Let me start by thanking New America and Peter Bergen for being such an excellent host and really paying very close attention to engaging authentic Syrian voices and injecting that voice into the larger discussion here in Washington, D.C. So thank you so much for hosting us. What I'm going to try to do, as Ammar alluded, is to sort of set a larger context as to why this book, why now, and since I am a lawyer, I have to throw some disclaimers. One of the disclaimers, and this is for sort of academic integrity, I was not one of the researchers of the book, so I think I'd be remiss to not mention that this book has been the culmination of a great effort of a number of Syrian researchers at the Omran Center, which I'm a proud co-founder of, and that is directly supervised by Dr. Ammar. So these people, their names are on the book, and I think they are worth of praise and of mention as well in such an event. This book has been the culmination of a way of thinking that we have been developing at the Omran Center for Strategic Studies, which is, by the way, a member of a larger consortium of organizations under the umbrella of something called the Syrian Forum. Both Ammar and myself are co-founders of that and sit on the board of directors of that consortium, and that is a consortium of organizations that directly engage with development and relief work on the ground in Syria, and also in providing very much needed services for Syrian refugees in Turkey mostly, and other places in Europe as well. So this is part of a thinking direction that we've developed based on what we call these local governance experiments that have been taking place in Syria since really 2011, 2012, where you had large swaths of Syrian territory that basically became void and vacant, and there was a vacuum created in terms of state institutions when the Syrian regime basically lost control over these areas and these territories. And a number of organic bodies started just coming together by locals to administer the basic affairs of these areas. And these were initially committees, and then they became into local councils and then local governing councils. And as Ammar was saying, particularly on the part of the quote-unquote opposition-held area, mostly Idlib nowadays, these councils came about through lot of times through quasi-democratic practices, direct elections, indirect elections, appointments, things of that nature. So we followed that experimentation, if you will, over the past 7 years, and we found ourselves investing a lot of time and energy and effort in highlighting this experiment, because to us, at the end of the day, as Syrians, at least the segment of Syrians that identify themselves with the pro-democracy movement that came about in 2011 as an extension of the Arab Spring, to us, essentially, this is what it's all about. It's about finding tools and mechanisms of deconstructing tyranny. And that comes from local mechanisms of power sharing and sharing the control of their resources, the control of their fate, the control of their own governance. And so that to us was an extremely important experiment or experience to highlight and to bring about and to talk about now 7 years in. Obviously, we did not want to throw in a discussion or a book out there that is an academic exercise or is a result of a discussion between only Syrians among themselves, although that has been a missing voice, and that is an extremely important thing to do. We also wanted to put something out there that is relevant to the political discussions and the political discourse that is taking place at the international level. And so we wanted to talk to power brokers that are controlling the fate or the direction of the political process in Syria, if you can call it that at all at this point. And so we started from the assumption that, look, that we do have a de facto fragmentation of Syria at this point. There are at least 3 distinct zones of influence, as Ammar was talking about. And these 3 distinct zones of influence have within them defragmented as well, or sub, if you will, zones or localities of governance and influence. And but these 3 zones of influence have, more or less common denominators within each of them that make each one of them a unique experience to the other. And so we took that context and we basically thought that a discussion or the combination of the information and the effort that we've been doing on local governance in general could be taken into consideration when we talk about how we can bring this picture back together. Everybody, all international actors, all international brokers, in terms of, at least in terms of discourse, talk about preserving the territorial integrity of Syria. Everybody talks about the woes and dangers of defragmentation and disintegration and separatism within Syria. But really nobody is talking about how, A, the current situation is exactly that, and B, how can we reverse that trend? And so as Syrians, we thought the way to do that is to actually poke into these, what some might see as taboo concepts. Decentralization is a taboo word for a lot of people. I mean, it immediately invokes the thought of Kurdish separatism, for example, in Syria. And we decided to approach it from a completely different angle and put the highlight on what has been going on locally in Syria on the local level over the past 7 years in terms of governance experimentation. And then take that as an entry point into forcing a discussion, if you will, that is a Syrian-led discussion based on Syrian authentic voices from the ground, and put it on the table and say, look, we are ready to talk about a healthy form of decentralization, and we think that the international community should pay attention to this and talk about this as well. Obviously, we couldn't stay at the political discourse level. We needed to authenticate what we talk about through studies and through documentation. And so you see the sort of the time frame, or the outline of the book, discussing in depth, on a conceptual level, what decentralization and centralization concepts mean. What have they meant to different political and geographic contexts in the past, to countries that have gone through similar conflicts or different conflicts. And what we found out is that the question of decentralization is a spectrum, is a spectrum concept. It's not a binary concept. So you cannot either say we are hoping for a hyper-centralized status quo ante model where you have a very strong central command in Damascus and that basically controls every inch of the territory with all of its components. And at the same time, which is really the wish and the behavior of the Assad regime right now, and the behavior of its allies. I mean, at the end of the day, and to be completely honest, and without having to resort to conspiracy theories, but there has been a lot of discourse on controlling or containing the violence and the mayhem and the disruption within Syria, so it does not spill into other areas and does not further destabilize the regime and the larger area. And a lot of Europeans and Western political figures have been talking about containing that by re-legitimizing and rehabilitating the Assad regime and granting that regime the power to govern once again in a central way. The only issue is that this is not feasibly possible anymore. Even if your political agenda was to rehabilitate the Bashar al-Assad regime and go back to a hyper-centralized model, you are going to miserably fail just because Bashar al-Assad and the regime do not have, or have completely lost, any semblance of state functionality in terms of political control, in terms of military control, in terms of financial, economic development. All of these aspects that make a state are no longer available. And these are also based on a number of studies that we've conducted in Omran over the years. And we have a lot of them throughout the past year that actually point to the power discrepancies between the allies of the Assad regime and the Assad regime itself, whether it's the Iranian militias, whether it's the Iranian indirect project of establishing a parallel state structure within Damascus and other urban centers that the regime has regained control of, whether through the Russian heavy investment in their presence, militarily and otherwise, and economically in Syria. So that reality is no longer up for discussion. I mean, that's hope of regaining a centralized model is no longer available for discussion. And so you go then to the other extreme of a decentralized model. And this is, again, where we say that more or less that's our reality at this point. And that's what, as Syrians, we do not want to see happen. And so we talk about within the book, and I really encourage everyone to, I think we have enough copies of the book. The book was originally written in Arabic, like many of our Omran publications, but we've, for special publications, we put quite a bit of effort and resources into producing it in almost an authentic version of English that is easily readable for English consumers. And so merely from our perspective, just forcing the discussion on decentralization from a Syrian perspective and putting it, introducing it to the political lexicon, if you will, of Syria, from our perspective is an extremely important thing to do. And that's what we have been attempting to do. And I'll wrap up in a couple of minutes. So one of the things that we also discuss in the book throughout, one of the themes that is discussed in the book is that a lot of the political discussions that are taking place right now focus on the top-bottom approach. So where everybody's talking about the Constitutional Committee and how it's going to be established and how that's going to basically resolve the political crisis, and then all parties will come to that Constitutional Committee and establish a constitution that will bring us to a better result. What we're saying is that that approach in of itself is, as I said before, is flawed. You want to engage those at the bottom, at the level of local governance, and bring those experiments up so they can bubble up to the top where they can meet that discussion that is taking place at the top. And so it's not a top-bottom approach, nor should it be a bottom-up approach. It should be a combination of both. Some of the most important, or some of the files that are basically discussed out there in terms of the political process right now, including the Constitutional Committee, including the issues that are most important for the U.S. government and the Russians and other main actors in the Syrian file, are the Iranian presence, are the question of ISIS and countering violent extremism in Syria, the question of reconstruction, the question of refugee repatriation. And I'll end here. All of these buzzwords, all of these elements of discussion that are taking place at the high level needs a Syrian. I mean, we have a crisis of agency of Syrians. We have a crisis of legitimacy. Who speaks on behalf of who? We really need to re-inject the Syrian discourse or the Syrian point of view in all of this. And when we're talking about questions of the Constitution, we shouldn't only be talking about what this Constitutional Committee should look like. We should also talk about issues of content. We should talk about how we could introduce and inject and ensure a model where you have a real power sharing as opposed to delegation by a central government to the peripheries. We need to talk about how can we come up with mechanisms that guarantee the enshrining the rights of the periphery within the Constitution into administering some of their affairs and controlling some of their resources in order for that discussion to actually be a valid one. In addition, obviously, to the general criticism that everybody talks about, which are we cannot talk about just the Constitution. We need to talk about mechanisms of implementing the ideals of that Constitution. I'll leave the other files actually for the discussion because I think they are more appropriate for what is taking place right now in DC as for the American agenda in Syria, and I think that would be more appropriate for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Yaser. So Mona.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks, Peter and New America, for hosting us, and congratulations, Ammar and Yaser and the Omran Center for, I think, a terrific book. I commend it to all of you because I think it is actually an authentic, very thoughtful, and very thorough treatment of what I think is really the critical question, honestly, going forward for Syria, if Syria is to find some sustainable path towards peace. And that really is sort of the role of decentralization. I want to be brief because I think it's important that we get the audience engaged in this, but so I'd like to reduce my comments to basically 4 points. The first really is about context. And the context that we find ourselves in with Syria today, which I think really underscores why this book is so important and why it's important now. And the two key contextual points I would make is one that unfortunately, as the conflict has evolved into now a complex, multi-layered, regional, and frankly, even global conflict, Syrians are increasingly, or the Syrian voice is increasingly left out of the discussion. And I think both Ammar and Yaser have made very, very important points here, and I would underscore them, how important it is to have a Syrian voice on this very critical issue of decentralization. Second contextual point is, at the same time, and somewhat ironically maybe, we see the Syrian regime consolidating its control over parts of Syria in a way that underscore, and I think the book lays this out, the importance of decentralization when there is a regime, and when you have a country such as Syria, a plural country that has gone through the trauma of the war that it has experienced, that I think we are seeing increasingly the value and the importance of decentralization, of devolving some degree of power away from the center. And I would argue this is an important point in the Arab world more broadly, where we should understand what's happened in Syria as part of a broader collapse of the social contract, and where in different instances we see that decentralization actually is quite an important element of a sustainable path towards peace. We see it in Iraq. We see it faultingly or haltingly in Lebanon. We may see elements of this in Libya and Yemen. And I certainly think it's important in Syria. And I think it's important particularly because of the nature of the current regime, and particularly because of the history that Syria has had with authoritarian regimes. And I would commend the book on many scores, one of which is, I think, an excellent analysis of Law 107 and the ways in which, as currently constituted, it is not fulfilling decentralization in a genuine sense. So that's the first point. Second point is a much more positive one, which is, as both my colleagues have laid out, there really is I think, fascinating and in many ways positive experiment that has gone on in opposition-held Syria over the past several years with decentralization. It has absolutely been bottom-up. It has been very organic. I had the honor of working on those issues from my vantage point at USAID, and I continue to follow these questions. And what I would underscore is this experiment has yielded, I think, some very positive experiences with local councils, not only in their ability to deliver services, which is important. The delivery of essential services is important for communities, but also the ways in which, even at the level of service delivery, that has provided an entry point to governance. And I would really underscore that those two issues cannot and should not be disentangled, that they are intimately linked. I think the book a little bit sometimes makes that distinction. I would not. I think, in particular, I would say, look at what happened in southern Syria, where you had a fairly extensive period of relative stability. It's all relative. In those areas, in Daraa and Quneitra. I know we're in a different place now, but I still think the experiment is important to understand. Where the entry point for building these local and eventually provincial councils was the provision of essential services, but in ways that were responsive to the local population, that were equitable and accountable. And so I think that there's a lot to learn, and we've seen other instances across Syria of ways in which these local councils have built themselves up, have become responsive to local populations, have knit themselves together at the local level, and have become also connected to provincial councils. I think this is a very important experiment that should be studied. That's why I commend the book. That's often forgotten because of all the trauma and all the tragedy and all the hardship that we see in Syria. There are, though, of course, challenges as well, and that would be my third point. And again, I think here, too, the challenges have been brought up. Certainly, the difficulties that many of these local councils have had in contending with armed actors and the regime, certainly in terms of the regime's barrel bombing and taking over of territory, But even in opposition-held areas, we continue to see, in Idlib, for example, as Ammar was noting, we see this struggle between armed actors and civilian governance structures and the difficulties that civilian local councils have in asserting themselves. We see it as well in eastern Syria, in areas that are controlled by the Syrian democratic forces. And so that, I think, is a continuing and very important challenge that needs to be understood. I think the book rightly points out some very specific issues in Kurdish-held areas, particularly as you move down to Arab-majority areas in Raqqa and Deir Zor, where you have still Kurds that are holding leadership positions that are actually calling the shots. It's not so much the composition, it's 50% Arabs, it's 50% Kurd, it's who actually has the power. And here I think the book rightly points out some of the difficulties there, the top-down approach, the lack of transparency, challenges in the realm of education, in particular, issues with forced conscription. These are all very, very valid concerns. And I think the book also raises something that we probably don't talk about enough in this town, and that is the cultural divide, again, in the Northeast, between an Öcalanist view of culture and society and a more sort of traditional Sunni Muslim, maybe Sharia-oriented perspective, where there's a deep clash there. And I think sometimes we don't, here in Washington, appreciate enough what that difference looks like. And so I would argue, I think this is good reading for colleagues in the US government, for colleagues that are working with the counter-ISIS coalition to understand some of the challenges that we need to be thinking about as we think about not only stabilizing these parts of Syria, but also deepening and improving local governance. I would also add, though, I think, and this is what I would have wanted to see more of in the book, and that is a deeper treatment of what's happening in areas that are being protected by Turkish forces. So the Euphrates Shield area in particular, Afrin, which I think has a whole boatload of issues related to it. But I think it would be important to understand better what are those local governance structures contending with, what's working, what's not. I would hope that we could have, frankly, more sharing and more lessons learned across these various fragmented areas of Syria. I think that's an essential and important step toward eventually knitting things back together, as Yaser has talked about. And that's probably a good sort of segue to my final point. And that is really, frankly, again, to underscore the importance of this book. And what I like about it is that, you know, I think one of the things we've learned in Syria is how quickly the situation evolves on the ground and how important it is not to wait. We cannot wait for a political settlement in Syria. We need to work with what we have on the ground now. And I wholeheartedly endorse the idea that this bottom-up, powerful model of local and provincial councils should be embraced, should be supported, and we should think about and understand how we can, in fact, use that as an entry point toward an ultimate sort of vision of what a politically stable and I hope ultimately democratic Syria will look like. I think that, again, I think it's of critical importance. So in particular, to conclude, I would say, some of the things we need to be focused on, and here I'm speaking as an American, I'm speaking as someone who was formerly in the US government and who continues to think a lot about what our policies should look like. I think we have to continue our efforts to strengthen and build the capacity of these local councils on the ground. It's critical. It's not just a security footprint, a US security footprint on the ground. I would argue, frankly, more important than that is the building of the capacity with our Syrian partners on the ground of local governance structures. I also think we need to understand and put much more time and thought into the political economy of assistance and governance. Who are the winners and who are the losers? Who is being ignored? Who is not gaining access to these local and provincial councils? Whose voices aren't being heard? Because I think this speaks to, frankly, the issues that brought Syria into this horrific conflict in the first place, and they need to be addressed. Issues about, sort of lack of equality amongst various communities, disparities in development, and the book talks about this, and I think it's a really important point to address. I am going to leave it there and look forward to further discussion and questions from our audience. Thank you.
Thank you. So Mona talked about U.S. policy. What is U.S. policy in Syria right now, and how do you see Ambassador Jeffrey kind of playing, what role is he playing?
Who are you directing that to? Do you want
Anybody.
Go ahead. Stab. We actually had a shorter discussion backstage on this earlier, and I think that the U.S. policy right now, there has been a clear attempt to clarify certain points of position on a number of important files vis-a-vis the Syria issue. And I think what Ambassador Jeffrey has been able to do is at least articulate that the U.S. is interested in a number of very specific points when it comes to Syria. And these points have to do with countering, ISIS, the ISIS presence, and making sure that it's eradicated and it's out of Syria, and dealing with its consequences, and making sure that there's some sort of a strategy to make sure that that's seen through. The second most important point has to do with the Iranian presence in Syria, and that is a point that is emphasized by this administration, not just in Syria, but in the larger region. And the third main point has to do with the type of government that the U.S. would like to see function in Syria. And I think there are those in the audience that are experts on the topic of the U.S. administration current position on Syria. But suffice it to say, from the perspective of this particular book, that in order for you, as the U.S. administration, to tackle these questions, to seriously talk about ending the Iranian military presence in Syria, or countering ISIS or other violent extremist organizations in Syria, or ensuring a government that does not that commits to the non-violation of human rights, and that commits to the question of accountability and all these things. In order for you to take that, those points from a theoretical, wishful thinking approach to a more realistic approach, you really have to engage and invest, as Mona was saying, in the local administration or local governance experiments that have been taking place over the years. A lot of these entities, and Ammar could elaborate on this as well, have demonstrated over the past years, specifically in concrete examples, on how local governance could actually fill in the vacuum where you have an area that is controlled by violent extremists, and the establishment of a local governance structure can be a more of a sustainable way of fighting that presence. Same thing with the question on Iranian influence or Iranian integration within Syrian state structures. I mean, Ammar was talking about the local administration elections in regime-held areas, where 95% of the candidates were actually from the Ba'ath Party. A very large percentage of those candidates actually came from personnel that were part of Iranian supported militias in some of these areas to integrate themselves within these local governance structures. And so unless we talk about that level of, whenever we dissect the issue down to these very basic levels of governance, then we're not going to be able to really deal with a problem as we see it as the administration here.
If you have a question, can you raise your hand and wait for the mic and identify yourself?
If there are no questions, then
We were very thorough.
The problem is solved.
problems.
This gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Jack Krapansky, unaffiliated. What about foreign policy? In terms of the different groups have different interests with different neighbors. So some, in terms of how they want to relate to Iran versus Turkey, for example. And also with Kurdistan, what about the aspirations of the Kurdish people for independence? How can that be kept down?
I mean, I didn't understand the first one about foreign policy, but starting from the end, if I understand your question, is how are these different parties related to the regional actors? Is that more or less your? So how are the local actors in the different zones? I mean, in the opposition areas, you have the competing Russian and Iranian interests, and even Chinese interests too. In opposition areas, you also have a lot of competing international, but since there was a question on Euphrates Shield, I think we do need to focus more perhaps in the next year as we start this year, I mean the 2019, to focus on field studies in the Euphrates Shield. We've done a little bit, but maybe not in this book specifically. I mean, there are issues of concern in terms of how are these local government, local councils being relating to the international actors. So who decides education policy in Jarablus or Azaz? Is it the local council president? Is it the interim government? Or is it the education ministry in Ankara? There are issues at stake, and it's really not the same in every city in the Euphrates Shield, so it's also varying degrees. It's as if I make, try to understand the thinking of the policymaker, either they're experimenting and they're testing the grounds, or the security element is very high that a lot of these things are really overlooked. So it's probably the local actors that are taking it upon themselves to decide on certain policies that are non-security related. So I think it's the latter. So I think it's in a lot of cases that we looked at where you had videos going on online of certain things that are objectionable to the local populations. And we find out that it's usually some local actor that wants to, prove his loyalty to the Turkish government, and they would do certain actions on their own without being requested to do. That's one type of relationships. The other types of relationships that have to deal with infrastructure, we know because we have a relief organization that operates in this area. And a lot of the permits, the licenses, have to come from the governor of Gaziantep for Jarablus, Kilis for, this is the Turkish city across. So a lot of, and that's also in terms of the long term, it's really not creating capacity. It's creating local councils that basically report to the authorities on the Turkish side. So administratively, there is a difference between administration and meaning governance and non-military, non-security, and security. So the governance, all the service, the public service delivery, really the reporting, the decision making is coming from matching or basically the government, the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health in Turkey, that is in charge across the border. There has been elections in a lot of the local councils. They do get some funding from the Turks and from other sources of funding. But it's really not, I mean, maybe if you compare it to other areas, they're much more advanced, but it's not the optimal case, meaning there is a conversation going on in a lot of these areas of how best we can restructure this relationship. And I think this is where when there is an empowerment of a provincial local council by Turkey, by even the international countries that are involved in this region, that we have a systematic approach of empowering a provincial or a regional council, committee, club, could be anything, that would at least unify the policy and strategy of these local councils. So if there is 36, 37, I think local councils minimum in the Euphrates Shield, then how is the decision-making processes taken? Now, all of these are usually carried through by elections or by local, consensus-building types, meaning they are technically, at least technically, not appointed by the Turks. So they, Turkey has not gotten itself involved in appointments per se, but more or less, that process has not yet matured, I think, to form like a unifying strategy among these local councils and empowering them. It's a process. I'm not saying it's not there, and it's maybe you can go to certain councils that are much more advanced where really the Turkish authorities allow them and empower them, and in other cities it's less. So it depends on which region. I don't know if I tried to answer as much as possible.
I think for that question you absolutely did, and as you were speaking I thought, boy, I hope you have a sort of a concept paper out there for another lengthy report, if not book, on this topic, because I think it's really of great importance. Could I maybe just say a word about the question? Because I think in a way your question, the second part of your question about the Kurds and their aspirations, I really think it sort of underscores the central tension around this issue of decentralization, which is sort of decentralization, but how far? Because I think this is the concern. I think you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but pretty much any Syrian you talk to will say they want a unified Syria. They are not interested in a partitioned Syria.
In fact, that's supported by some of the polls that were conducted to about 450 local councils in the Idlib area as well.
Exactly, yeah. And I think for the Kurds, I think there is a tension there, but I also think that Kurds ultimately see some sort of evolved semi-autonomy within a broader Syrian context. But it is a tension, and it is a real challenge. And for me, I've always, as an analyst, I think about this as a central paradox, which is, in a way, to keep Syria together, you have to somewhat decentralize it. It's somewhat maybe doesn't make sense, but that's exactly where I think the country needs to go. But this will be, again, correct me if I'm wrong, this will be years of deep thinking and negotiation over time as to what it looks like. But ultimately, a unified Syria likely will need to be a decentralized Syria. And managing that balance will be a critical challenge.
That raises the issue. I mean, here we sit here in the United States, we had a sort of civil war that was something to do with some of the same issues in the sense of what level of decentralization and what level of independence. And you could argue that we're still living with the kind of, the Reconstruction took, we're still living with some of the fallout from that. So when I hear everything that you've all said, I've got to say it's very depressing. I mean, because you're trying to, stitch this thing back together, but, I always thought the Afghan-Pakistan problem was very complicated because there's so many outside actors and so many ethnic groups, but this seems much, much harder. And so I guess the first question is, what, if somebody from the regime was here, and I presume no one from the regime is here, and what would they say to this? What you're saying? Because, I mean, they won the war. I mean, it seems, right? I mean, that seems uncontroversial. And when you win the war, you kind of it's your way or the highway, right? So, yeah, I think Yaser said that it would be very hard for them to go back to complete control. But so, realistically, how do you make this happen with a sort of totalitarian state that basically thinks it's won and kind of has won?
I mean, I think the definition of winning needs to be looked upon, because it depends who won, first of all, and what they won. Did they win Syria? Did they win the Syrian people? Did they win the 60% of the population that's outside of its areas and regions? Is it Russia that won? Is it Iran that won? Is it Syrian businessmen that profited from the process? I mean, it's the coalition, the cult around Bashar al-Assad has shifted, has changed during the crisis, meaning that cult that was there in 2011 is no longer holding the same power that it used to today, at that time. So it no longer holds the same power. And so now you have new economic actors, new business people. You have new militias that control certain regions in the regime areas. You have a military institution that lost 4/5 of its artillery, of its equipment, of its manpower. You have a military academy that has not graduated a single graduate in the last 8 years. You have a complete meltdown of ministries, of local councils, of local service delivery institutions within the state infrastructure that has not been funded, meaning there are government institutions that have not paid salaries for a long time. You have certain villages in its own population, in its own loyalist areas that really demand, you have small protests, relatively smaller, but in areas in Tartus or Latakia areas that have protested against oppressive regime practices, and these are loyalists, and have said, how come the town 10 kilometers or 5 kilometers away, or in US it's miles, so a few miles down the block, have elections and we don't? And this is why the regime was pushed to actually conduct the so-called elections of September 2018. And so, that's one side of it. And so there is a lot of depression going on, but I see the other side of the success, of the progress. And I see it not as a zero-sum game, as a winning or losing, but I see it as a process. And I think that process has kicked in, meaning there is no way back to the previous methods and tools and manners and approaches to governing these local populations, even within the loyalist population. So, and when we go to the northeast, there's also very complex issues of how do you govern these areas? How do you govern both the Arab tribes? I mean, look at the Suwaidat, which is in the southeast of Syria. It has been, and it seems to be, governed in a self-administration type governance structure. And it seems that is how, and it's mainly predominantly Druze sect. And so, you see these new experiences. When we talk about local councils, really, Yaser has been in meetings in 2012, as early 2012, meeting with some of the local actors in Syria about how do you form local councils. And skimming through these 8 years or 6 years since then, I think it has accomplished. I mean, for a full country called Russia to go in and bombard the entire regions of the opposition, we still have 458 local councils. We have at least 30 displaced local councils. So the governing council of Damascus suburb is still in operation. It has an office in Idlib, in the suburbs of Idlib in the north, and it's now servicing. It has civil records. It has documentation of the right of return. So trying to advocate for the right of Damascene and suburb Damascus people to go back to their homes. So it has a much more expanded legal department, talking about law number 10 and the housing, and so there are a lot of challenges that are going on. So I see that side of the aisle. I see a lot of more opportunities, and this is where
are these local councils taxing people?
A lot of them are. I mean, I think one of our findings has been that at least 30% of the local councils, if not less, I mean, just a few percentage points less, are self-sufficient, meaning they have revenues that either bakeries or, fees to the services, whether it's cleaning fees or, stamp. In the Middle East, it's very common to have a stamp for every government document and a signature. So the stamps, it's basically like miscellaneous fees and taxes and so forth, whether it's for civil records, marriage, documentation of real estate exchange, and so forth. So there are a good percentage of, and especially, and maybe that's one of the, I mean, there are challenges, but there are also a lot of positive things taking place in the Euphrates Shield, is that because the security situation is relatively, compared to many other regions, more stable or less risky, local councils have a much more stable environment to operate under. Now, they are still once in a while being threatened by some of the armed groups, even in the Euphrates Shield, but it's not as bad as
the Euphrates
Idlib.
Shield is
the Idlib,
Turkish.
Yes, it's fully
Turkish controlled. Turkish
Yes.
army controls.
Yes.
I mean, the challenge with your taxation question is that is there a legal framework that basically brings all of this taxation into place, and for it to make, we make sense of a fiscal policy that sort of governs and redistributes resources and determines development priorities and all that stuff. And I think you'll see a lot of these local councils ready to sort of be plugged into a larger legal framework. The challenge is, how can we establish that common denominator of a legal framework across the entire 3 zones of influence? And I think this goes back to your question earlier, Peter, is that, yes, I mean, the challenge, yes, we're facing a regime that wants to go back to extreme centralization. They don't have the tools to do it, but that doesn't seem to matter to them, because from the very beginning they've been acting in a self-preservation mode, and that's what motivates them primarily. And decentralization, for sure, goes against that. I mean, that actually will be the end of that particular regime. Now, how do you deconstruct that very complicated catch-22? And I think that's where international brokers, people who have a say, or countries who have a say, powers who have a say in Syria, need to start forcing that conversation. That conversation has to be forced also from the top. That's, okay, we need to start talking about decentralization as a solution, and as tools of. And really quickly, I want to address the question of the gentleman, or an aspect of the question of the gentleman that in the front row. In terms of loyalties of some of these areas to foreign powers, I mean, that's one of the more interesting aspects of any decentralization model in Syria, that you'll see that the zones of influence, as written in the map that Ammar showed, to not be commensurate with the sectarian fault lines in Syria. They're not. We're not. I mean, the sectarian makeup of Syria is so diverse and so integrated that, for example, the area that's that we call East Euphrates and that is controlled by the quote-unquote the Kurdish forces is majority Arab. I mean, population-wise. The area that is controlled by the regime is majority Sunni. And so you're not talking about, so that layer of sectarianism and is not there. So that's one less problem to deal with when it comes to the question of decentralization in Syria, I think. And that's something that probably Mona has a lot to say on. Yeah.
Well, if I could, just one quick point on your initial question, Peter, because I think, and as Yaser has also just laid out, I mean, this regime absolutely is diametrically opposed to the notion of decentralization. And you're right that the regime has largely prevailed, certainly in the civil war. Again, bearing in mind there are several different conflicts going on at the same time. But I would argue it's a Pyrrhic victory And there is no return to the status quo ante. There's no way to get the genie back in the bottle. This is a regime that has really been hollowed out, that it's as fragmented as things are in non-regime held Syria, so too in regime held Syria. The sort of patchwork of militias that the regime is reliant upon for security is just one example. The new actors, the new sort of warlords and those who have benefited from this sort of war economy is another example economically. And so the question, though, I think the key question that maybe you're alluding to is, okay, if that is correct, then what is the means by which to compel movement and to compel a political settlement toward that embraces this notion of decentralization? Is this something that has to wait until a post-Assad Syria? Can we wait? If not, how to compel the regime? What's the leverage, and how does one compel a regime that is wholly resistant to the notion of decentralization?
What's the answer?
If I had that, I'd be a much more highly paid woman than I am.
No, but it's a serious question.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's something we all have to, this is what we should be grappling with right now.
I mean, now you're talking about, Russia is extremely interested in two files right now. It's interested in the file of reconstruction, and it's interested in the file of refugee repatriation. Yeah. And to the point where one would argue that their support to the regime, to their ally, is somewhat contingent upon making some progress on these two files. I think that could be an entry point.
Yeah.
I mean,
and recognition. It's also looking for international recognition, and therefore, if that recognition is withheld until there is a political settlement that is more reflective of the aspirations.
There's a lot of academic research on why people come to the peace table, right? And I think it's Zartman, right? It's a mutual recognition of a hurting stalemate. So the United States is in a hurting stalemate that has got it to the negotiation table with the Taliban, despite the fact that 3 or 4 months ago the Trump administration wasn't even thinking about it. So history would suggest that when you win a war or think you've won a war, you're not going to do. Yep. And compelling this regime seems, the Russians, I mean, they have interest in reconstruction, you say, but they have very few clients, and particularly very few clients with access to a warm water port. So, I mean, how much compulsion would the Russians really put on Assad, even if they think he's an unpleasant guy and they don't admire? I don't know. I mean, it just seems like, I mean, if the Iranians and the Russians are the only groups, the only countries that might be able to compel him, certainly the United States has very little influence with either of them. So what might change for the Assad regime to sort of recognize that some kind of deal is helpful?
I think it's going to be a long-term process. I mean, I think it's, I mean, and I think that, look, there has been a lot of U.S. support of local governance structures in the past, but what's, I think, part of the point that you were making earlier is that more support needed there. But what I would even argue that is that support was never connected to the larger political discussion. Correct. And I think that missing link has to be rectified.
So do you think the Trump administration is going to do a better job now of this? I mean, with Jeffrey, and I mean, or is it just, I mean, the problems are too big and they can just fiddle around the edges? I mean, what?
I mean, I think one of the entry points is to talk about Iran, and so far, the announced policy to counter Iranian influence in the region and so forth, I haven't seen yet I mean, other than the sanctions, but I mean, this is, Saddam lived through 12 years of sanctions and has the ability to survive, and Assad has perhaps a much more ability to survive types of sanctions. I mean, we have a total parallel economy in Syria, even prior to 2011, meaning the transfer of money and so forth. And Hezbollah is another example of how it continues to survive. So I mean, I think one of the ways you can weaken and put pressure on the regime is to push out Iran through systematic approaches. I mean, this is not either a military or economic sanctions. I think there are so many ways in between these two options. And when we limit ourselves with Iran to just talk about these two, it becomes problematic and depressing.
And clearly there's dissatisfaction amongst Iranians about the cost of this expedition, so that potentially...
I mean, because basically today, our assessment of the regime areas is it relies heavily, it's like completely in the hands of Iran, even on service delivery projects, education sector, health sector in Damascus, in Deir ez-Zor, in Aleppo. Look at the number of schools being built in Aleppo. I mean, I think this is one thing that perhaps is important. I mean, and we don't see these things happening in Raqqa or in other areas that were liberated from ISIS, meaning, and that's a dangerous zone where the US was involved in cleaning up these areas from ISIS, but yet we don't have a new system. Look at the Euphrates Shield. We have new highways, roads, hospitals, infrastructure that has allowed close to 100,000 Syrians to go back to those regions. And now, you know, Turkey is closing down some of the camps in Turkey. I mean, not pushing people out, but saying there's no need to sit in camps. I mean, there's a safe zone inside, or you go and have jobs in Turkey. And so, you know, you talk about reconstruction or refugee repatriation. There is no. I mean, that's one of the things that you can put pressure. And then the first one was Iran. Putting pressure on Iran really puts pressure on the regime. The regime has little budget and has little manpower.
Okay, so we're going to take this gentleman, and this gentleman, and this gentleman, and we're just going to take them together because we've got 2 minutes left. So,
I just wanted to ask this, to know, can you tell me how much of a consensus the Syrian people altogether, including the regime, have with respect to the constitution? Is Syria being recomposed or reconstituted? Because if it's about a constitution, it's really much more serious. But can you comment on this? If the Syrian people have a consensus around the constitution, including the regime, or not, and based on what you know now, if there is a recomposition or reconstitution.
okay. This gentleman.
Hi, my name is Rory Coleman. I'm an intern at the Middle East Institute. I was just wondering, we've discussed a lot about Iran and Russia. I wonder if you could talk just briefly about the role of other regional powers, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, who have an interest in countering Iran's influence, who might be looking to flex their influence a little bit, and what role they might play in helping bring about this vision you have for Syria.
Okay, fun.
Hi, thank you. David Harari from the Center for Development and Strategy. Curious whether you guys touch upon environmental quality and resource insecurity, water, food, and those kind of things, especially with trade, pertaining to these councils as well.
Okay, and then this gentleman here. And we're going to, it was water.
I didn't hear the question.
I mean, basically a question about water.
Water, food security.
Water and food security. So,
yeah. Thank you all for your great insights. When talking about the local councils in the opposition areas, you described the one that you describe as the only bottom-up model. What is the direct impact of the US and the EU pulling aid away from those local councils? And what is the long-term impact if we continue on this trajectory, especially from stabilization and countering extremism?
okay, and don't feel like you have to answer all 4 of those questions each, because that's 12 answers, and we're basically out of time. So just like whatever you think are the kind of key question you want to address.
I'll go very quickly, and
Yeah.
I'll answer 2 of the questions. The one on foreign influence in Egypt, Saudi, and Israel, and their roles in this. I think Egypt and Saudi Arabia, frankly, Egypt has never really played a significant role in Syria, and Saudi Arabia's interest has really diminished significantly as it has pivoted and turned its attention much more toward Yemen, with an asterisk that the Saudis have provided, as part of the Trump administration's attempt at burden sharing, have provided now, I believe, $100 million in stabilization assistance. Israel, I think the issue for Israel is Iran primarily, or completely. And there, I think, though, we're at a very dangerous time, because I think the Israelis, for them, this is, it sounds like to be an existential issue. They had been working somewhat cooperatively with the Russians. That cooperation diminished recently, but I won't go into, events have happened. I think we're at a moment where, for me, what's more concerning is that there could be unintended escalation between Israel and Iran in a way that really redounds badly for Syrian civilians on the ground in Syria. The last question I will take, which I think is a critical one, and I thank you for asking it because it gives me a chance to make my point, that I think U.S. commitment to stabilization funding in Syria is essential. And as I said before, I hope we have learned the lessons from Iraq. I hope we understand that if we are seeking the enduring defeat of ISIS or any sort of extremist group, it is essential that we provide assistance, both stabilization assistance and over time governance assistance, to local Syrians on the ground to ensure there is no vacuum that is opened up and that is often filled by extremist groups. Instead, I think, frankly, we owe it to Syrians, given the amount of devastation that has occurred, particularly in Raqqa, which is 80% destroyed as a result of the counter-ISIS strikes. It is imperative that we be there, that we stay for the duration with respect to some degree of stabilization funding.
Go ahead. And she answered the two questions that I actually answered.
Sorry, Yaser.
I think with regards to
Sorry.
the Constitution, if I may answer that one, one of the problems is I think the regime has, and with Iran actually, with a deep state, parallel state structure, they're able to get away with any type of constitution. So you can put the best constitution. They removed the Article 8 in 2012, 6 years ago. What happened in Syria? Nothing. The Ba'ath Party is now still controlling the police forces, the promotion, the acceptance into the police academy, all the government, lower government, and this is not per the Constitution, but per laws that are executive, basically decrees and proclamations and so forth, that allow the Ba'ath Party to come back into becoming the main force in the process. The other issue with the Constitution is that the discussions now going on about the Constitutional Committee and so forth, I think there's no framework for their operation. There's no, and it's always a share, and this is the last chapter in the book, that the approach is always a sharing of, not a sharing of power, but a sharing of government seats, of a government, so a unity government. So basically the best scenario for the international envoy, I'm going to talk about the former one, I haven't seen yet the actions of the new one, but is a sharing of seats in the unity central government, and that's it. And that doesn't create stability at all. I think that what is needed there is more of a power sharing, of a true devolution of powers, whereby local elected officials have the higher say to any other appointed official, meaning the governor, so-called governor position in the 14 provinces should be elected governors that report to the people down, so they report downwards, not upwards to the central government. And that's been one of the, and that the regime is resisting to. Will always continue to resist to doing it.
Well, we want to thank you very much, Ammar, Yaser, and Mona, for a brilliant presentation.
Thank you.